Good morning, Journey. This has been a whirlwind of a weekend for me. We just got back from Wichita. Reagan is home. Yeah, really excited about that and going to be able to spend the rest of the summer with her. Really, really cool. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give a tenth of your mint and rue and all kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you're like unmarked graves, which people walk over without even knowing it. Journey, this is not your normal table conversation. It's not your normal dinner party. This is a conversation that is full of personal challenge and even conflict. And it just, like as we enter the conversation, it makes me really kind of take a step back of what's going on here. Jesus moves into this conversation about some woes that he's challenging some people about. And one of the famous passages that this comes from is Matthew chapter 23. But this is not that. In Matthew 23, when Jesus is giving the woes to the Pharisees, he's at the temple and there's tons of people around and he's making a point. This conversation is a little different. This conversation's at the table. He's inside somebody's house, quite literally laying down at the table with his arm leaned forward while he's eating, eyeballing the people he's talking to. Before we get into it, let me ask you, could you imagine Jesus sitting at your table? Can you imagine inviting him in and what you want that to be? And now, could you also imagine that as soon as the dinner party gets started, Jesus offends you by his irreligious behavior? Like, everything's set, you're good to go, and he just starts eating before you pray, right? Like, what's going on, Jesus? Don't you know how this goes? And he just looks up from you and he's like, yeah, I know how this goes, and it shouldn't be going this way. And the whole conversation of at the meal and at the table is changed by him because of it. I think about this Pharisee, and there's one of three motivations that he has for inviting Jesus to the table. Number one, like he's really excited and he wants to celebrate with the teacher and honor him. Maybe that's where we would go immediately. Number two is that he's invited Jesus to gain prestige, like to be associated with a teacher that's gaining a crowd. Or number three, to actually put Jesus in a situation that is difficult and trip him up and challenge him. Motivations matter. If you look in the immediate context right before we get here, Jesus is coming off of conflicts with religious leaders. And he teaches and he challenges them about the reality of the kingdom of God versus what they're seeing and expecting. Our passage that we read during communion, they're not seeing, all right, their eyes have become dark. So I can't help but wonder if the Pharisee was looking to be offended by Jesus. So Jesus turns and he jumps in, but before we address the content, we have two objectives for you today. And they're this. Number one, listen very carefully to what Jesus has to say to the Pharisee and the people around the table. But number two, as he teaches them, he's teaching us. And so for us to ask the question, I told a couple of our ladies before we entered, gird your loins today. Because here's where we're going. As he has these conversations with them, what I want to ask of us is if we were sitting at this table, what would he have to say to us? How would he respond in like kind to us? So the Pharisee is, just real quick background, the Pharisees were probably the most influential sect of the Jews. For our day in religious world, think denomination, right? It doesn't work exactly, but it's close. This Pharisee wasn't necessarily like in high leadership, but he was associated, all we know is he's a Pharisee, he's associated with a prominent group of religious leaders. And this group is known for being extremely precise about following the law. Like they were committed to it. To the point that they taught orally, they borrowed from the law and said, okay, if the law says this, well, we're going to teach you these things to follow. And they enforced oral tradition to make sure that people followed the law correctly. That's the background in a SparkNote version. So here we go. The Pharisee looks at Jesus as the meal begins, and he's offended because Jesus has not washed before the meal. And the quick conversation that Jesus has is you guys wash the outside of the cup and you leave the inside untouched. Like, can you imagine going to somebody's house and they give you a cup that looks really pristine when they serve you coffee? And as you look, you're drinking the coffee and you get all the way down and it's really good coffee, but you get to the bottom and there's a big piece of mold that's stuck on the bottom. Like, and you've already drank all of it and you're like, what the? Like, would you throw up a little bit in your mouth? Jesus is saying that's what's going on here, people. Like, in your pursuit and religious world with God, you do all of these outside exterior things to make everything look right. And in the inside, like, it's wretched. It's disgusting. Because you haven't cared for it and you haven't washed it in 2 years. It's oral tradition stuff. Like, the Matthew chapter 7 gives us a little bit more context, but I'll just quickly tell you this. The Jews, the Pharisees, practiced that they would not eat anything once they came back from the marketplace without going through some ceremonial washings. And the actual language is wash with a fist. And it was one of two things. It was either washing vigorously like this, or washing up to your fist and maybe even up to your elbow. It was a ceremonial washing that designated this. I just was around the world and they are gross, disgusting people. They are unbelievers. They are not clean. And I am cleansing myself of that before I engage in this. I'm not going to take this unclean stuff and put it into my body because I've been exposed to brokenness. Like, that's what they're doing. And Jesus is like, you may have rubbed up against some unclean people, but have you checked your inside? Are you sure you're clean in here? And he goes all the way in and he says, the one who made the outside is the same one who made the inside. You should have paid more attention to that. Be generous with the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Okay, so I told you to gird your loins, so let's go. What would he have said with us? We don't have these weird washing ceremonies, right? But we have our religious ritual. We have our practices that make us feel good. Do we rest on regular worship attendance? Please, I'm not the guy that's going to tell you don't show up here. Right? Do we rest on our rhythm of a daily devotional and maybe even brag of that with our friends? This Pharisee was offended because of this cleansing ritual, which again was a separation, an attempt to separate from an ungodly world. Well, what about, could you imagine Jesus sitting at your table and you or someone else be offended because he didn't participate in the boycott of an ungodly business? He wasn't as separated from the world as you expect him to be. Jesus' push and challenge is quit looking at the outside and look on the in. And he goes directly at one thing. He says, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. So how about us? Do you know maybe a widow in your neighborhood that has had COVID? Have you cared for her? Do you know a young couple that's really struggling with their bills and is overwhelmed with parenting? And have you offered to help? Jesus is pushing toward real-time change for the people of God. He's basically saying, do these things out of the overflow of your life, and you'll be working from a clean inside. Everything will function different. So that's the conversation he has before he even gets to any of the woes to you, right? And basically, woe is, it's deep regret. It is him turning and expressing grief for what he's seen. And the first woe goes like this. He says, you give 1/10 of your mint and rue and garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. This command for the people of God to tithe was very early in their life. Like it came in Deuteronomy chapter 14. Like as soon as the people of God are being formed together, this command to give 1/10 to the work of God and to take care of his people is given. And I love the Deuteronomy passage when it comes to describing this because it tells you why. In the Deuteronomy chapter 14 passage, there are 3 so that's. And it says this. It says, give of your grain, your wine, your olive oil, your firstborn of the flock, so that, number 1, you will revere the Lord. Basically, so God will be God for you. Number 2, so that the Levites, foreigners, fatherless, and widows will be satisfied. Basically, the Levites who cannot work on their own, they're dependent. The priest group are dependent on the people of God for their livelihood. Take care of them and take care of everyone else that's dependent. The foreigners who can't work, the fatherless who can't work, the widows who can't work, people who will die without you giving of your stuff. And then number 3, so that God will bless you. So there's great motivation for the people of God to do these things. And the Pharisees practiced this and even added all of these other expectations of just to make sure that they didn't miss any of the things that could be tithed. Giving from the top of your first to God. And Jesus is like, awesome, good. You should have done that without neglecting justice and the love of God. Like just giving of your money and neglecting looking and functioning like the people of God, like it's not gonna work. So what about us? We should for sure give off the top of our stuff without neglecting justice. Let me show you, it's been quite some time for us of giving off the top of our stuff. Let me show you our tithe. So we started this year with a $47,000 a year budget. And we started the first 2 months, oh man, we did really well. The next 3, we've been a little bit under. My encouragement to you in this teaching from Jesus is this: wherever you find yourself financially with God, like, give to Him. Give from your top. And if you've never tithed the 10%, if you've never given to God from your stuff, start with 1%. Start with 2%. And watch what God does. Those so that's change things. So that God will be God for you. So that those who depend on you will be taken care of. And so that He may bless you. But let's not be a people who stop there. Let's be a people who live in justice and the love of God. And so let me ask you, in our culture, what about the disenfranchised and the underprivileged? Do you know any U.S. immigrants? Have you ever heard their stories? Have you ever invited them into your home? How about, do you know someone from another race? It's one of the things I love about our family is we are a blended family. Honestly, I wish that we were more, Will. Do you know each other's stories? Have you invited someone from another race into your home? The table is a great place to start practicing justice and the love of God. The second thing that he says in the woe to the Pharisee is, you love the important seats. And he says it without even further explanation, because we know, right? We know. Pride's a cancer. So I ask us, how much of what we do and how we function our lives is built around looking for approval from other people? How much of the decisions that you make about the phone that you have, the car that you drive, the clothes that you wear, revolves around seeking approval from someone else? Jesus is saying your eyes are in the wrong place. We need to fix our focus. In 2013, 2014, I wrote a book for this church family. It's called Reckless Pursuit, the story of God's relentless love. And as this was getting published, I thought it was a good idea to just market it a little bit and start a blog and post 3 times a week and let people know that it's coming. But one of the things that happened to me is this looking for approval started rotting my soul. Every time I would post, I would look to see how are people grabbing this? Are people looking? Are people responding? And I noticed my hamstrings when I would post something would just get tight. And I realized fairly quickly What was meant to be a blessing to you has become a curse to me. And I made a decision to go into a 40-day period of fasting from media to get rid of it. Jesus says, you're like unmarked graves. That people walk over them without even knowing it. Like you look good, but you're dead inside. I want to encourage you to go home and read this. I want to encourage you to spend your week focusing on the challenge that Jesus is giving. It doesn't stop here. He has a conversation with the teacher of the law, which is a scribe or someone who spends their whole life in Scripture. And that guy's offended because he's talking to the Pharisees and he's seeing himself. He's like, Jesus, when you say these things, you offend us too. And Jesus is like, oh, well, good. Let's go have that conversation. And that's where I want to leave you. Like, I've got 2 more hours worth of content for you here. And I'm going to leave you with this. Oh, good. Let's go have that conversation. Because it's like, what would he say to us? And I'll just tell you, at the end, for the teachers of the law, he says, you put burdens on people. Because of the way that you teach Scripture, you put burdens on them and they can't even find God. Like, you ought to be the people that are making him visible and available and attractive. And instead, it's exactly the opposite. Journey, the people of God ought to be the most attractive people in the world, and our God ought to be the greatest gift that we have to offer. And if our religion is killing that, we need to kill that religion. Go home and read this and see what he has to say about the difference between a heart that is transformed in chasing God and outer religious action that has nothing to do with that. At the end of the conversation, it says that Jesus went outside and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. And their response to all of this is exactly the problem. Instead of having an inside that is open to the things of God and being actually called out and then changed, they are shut down and ready to fight when challenged. Our exterior religion should only fuel the flame for our interior transformation.